The door closed behind her and locked securely. The light was shut out, and we were safe, Thupten and I. We could never be safe out there in the light. The world had seen us, and the world hated us. Together, here, we would be safe. Safe from crushes, safe from Mr. Riley, safe from adulthood, safe in our single childhood, shielded by a protective playground for unfolding souls. At least for a short while. At least until we grew sturdy enough to approach the light with our own. We instantly headed for the back hallway that led to Thupten's room. Panic got up and followed us. Thupten asked if he knew any tricks, and I told him I didn't know. We paused in the hallway for a moment and considered him curiously. He wagged his tail. We got to his door and he punched in his alpha code. Fig tree. The door opened and we walked in. Panic was right behind us and he narrowly avoided being smashed against the door jamb. Thupten's room was very comfortable. He had a seat on his bed and motioned over to me to do the same. My mind was elsewhere and I stood there looking dazed, daydreaming about an angel of fire flying through the air. "Sit," Thupten said. Both I and Panic had a seat where we were standing. Thupten giggled and covered his mouth shyly with his hands. "Well, it looks like both of you have had formal dog training." Panic curled up in a ball and smiled, exposing the teeth behind his dog lips. We talked for a long while about school things. It was mostly inane chit-chat that distracted both of us from what was really on our minds. Sometimes you can't see the forest for all the trees. I had forgotten that Thupten had something heavy on his mind, but maybe I was talking so much about so little because on some level, I knew his secret. I was worried about having to go home the next day. I was worried about seeing Emily in the hall. But most of all, I started to become aware of a feeling. One that I had felt vibrating at such a low frequency, I had previously ignored it. But it had begun to turn into a sensation that was very real, a twist in my guts. A sound that only part of me could sense. A more clairvoyant part of me that was pruned into submission long ago. This is what prophets call hidden knowledge. This is what shrinks call paranoid delusion. However, it was also the distinct and obvious voice of impending doom. I held my stomach unconsciously and rocked back and forth as I looked around Thupten's room. I studied it, though I had seen it many times before. I wanted to save it like a time capsule. I reached into my pocket and petted the golden orbs of my mother's old clock. We continued our small talk while I let my eyes wander. It really looked like his house could take a bomb or an earthquake. I'm sure his father intended this. His walls were old tires packed full of earth, reinforced with rebar and concrete, and covered in adobe. They had several band posters plastered across them. A large mirror was built into one wall, and under it was a low, wide chest of drawers that was carved out of one piece of wood and bolted to the ground. A dark, hard wood desk held Thupten's computer and stereo. Thupten's bed was hewn of rough tree trunks fashioned together with hemp cords. In the corner by Thupten's bed was what looked like a sandbox. It looked weird now, but it was once a well-kept Zen garden. His television sat on the floor and was surrounded by gaming systems, controllers, and a plethora of video games. He only had 2 lampstands to illuminate his room, and they stood on either side of a wall mural of a fig tree and a grapevine that Thubten had painted. The only source of natural light was a small porthole in the ceiling that let the sun in at exactly 3 o'clock p.m. It was focused into a straight beam of light that bounced off a group of slightly angled mirrors that were positioned under a round pane of glass in the center of the floor. This scattered the beam into several smaller rays that each shot a segment of adobe wall or concrete ceiling, which held a small mirror. The room was so painstakingly designed that the light bounced off of dozens of these tiny star-shaped mirrors and literally illuminated the whole room naturally, if only for a few minutes. It was a solar alarm clock that I had awoken to many times in summers past. It was annoyingly beautiful, but it ensured that we were up in time to have at least 2 solid meals of Thubten's mom's delicious cooking. We decided on a game of Perfect Dark on the Nintendo 64 while we listened to music. We were blasting little big-headed gray aliens with machine guns, clutched tightly in their 3-fingered hands when Thubten's dad got home. The doorbell sounded through the whole house through stealthy stereo speakers positioned unobtrusively in the corners. He walked back to Thubten's room and greeted us. He welcomed me warmly. We talked briefly. He addressed me like any parent would one of their child's playmates. He asked how school was and said he had a new toy he was playing around with. Thubten and I followed him out to his workshop, and he entertained us with gadgets and gizmos for a few hours. Thubten's father, Narayan Tenzin, was somewhat of an eccentric among his neighbors. He was like a modern-day Tesla. He had a workshop behind his house as big as a barn where he tinkered with all sorts of gadgets. It was solidly built and insulated with rubber, just like his house. He had hand-built the windmill and generator that powered his home. He had several stripped pickup trucks, a half-dismantled crane, battery pallets, magnets, wires, and old computers scattered around. He was not formally schooled in electrical engineering or mechanics. His collegiate training was in philosophy. At the time, he was working on a silent magnetic over-unity generator. It would convert AC to DC to power a centrifugal electromagnet that would turn a turbine, outputting 100 times as much energy as was put in. These allowed him to power every LED light in his home and heat his self-built swimming pool off of his wind turbine in a slow breeze. It could be powered by battery packs and refuel a drained pack while outputting enough energy to run every appliance in one's home. Free energy. He was also working on a small model of a triangular ionic wind anti-gravity lifter from foil, balsa wood, 30-gauge wire, and a DC amplifier harvested from an old computer monitor. This, when switched on and supplied power, would levitate without propeller, jet, or any conventional means of propulsion or lift. He specializes in technologies he feels were once discovered but hidden by our governments and other influential powers shrouded in secrecy. I know all of this sounds crazy, but Dad claims these technologies exist, and so he spends his time duplicating them for his own purposes. I don't know exactly why he does what he does, Thubten told me. His family was safe. His devices were all EM shielded. In his backyard was a ditch, 12 foot by 12 foot, shrouded in a canopy of bamboo. In this camouflaged thicket was a powerful EMP generator that could knock out all electronics within a 150-mile radius. If the government discovered this project, he would be labeled a traitor and terrorist and sent to a place from which he wouldn't return. He knew this, and he built it anyways. He didn't know why, and he didn't even consider not constructing the device, even though he knew all the consequences of his actions. Thupten would often sit with his father in his workshop. He was fascinated by the jumping sparks as a child. He delighted in the mirrors of the foot-long, multifaceted crystals that his father held suspended within distilled water in transparent glass tubes lined with electrodes. He was thrilled at the sensation of low-frequency electrocurrent moving invisible through the air. He brought his father tools and learned about electromagnetism, photon wave energy, and the harmonic frequencies of life. He helped his father with his invention, his weapon of mass destruction. His father said a voice in his head told him to make this device while drifting off to sleep one night. In a dream, he began construction of the device, and when he awoke the following morning, he made his dream reality. He didn't challenge this compulsion. He followed blindly behind it, like Noah. This was his purpose. Tesla said that his inventions came to him in his dreams. He could bounce this EM burst off of clouds and the magnetic cone of our atmosphere, so his position could not be triangulated. There was no boom, and there was no limit to the number of discharges. 600 alternators and a double helix wind turbine and revolutionary solar cell power the anti-weapon weapon. This was combined with a 10-foot grid of tiny microphones that were pointed at the rumbling underground earth power supply. Each microphone held a magnetic rod that penetrated into a centimeter-long copper cylinder. Each contraction of the magnetic coil would channel sound energy and convert into electricity like a million tiny pistons. The machinery was powered by its own humming vibrations. The weapons of our societies, East and West, harness the destruction and desecration of atoms, the building blocks of life, the microcells that hold the memory and internal pattern of God. Narayan's weapon harnessed all the invisible energy that was all around us, the wind, the sun, and the tiny invisible particles we issue when we communicate. The Logos fueled his weapon. His own home's power would not be hampered. His lights would be hidden from the world by the wilderness, the nature that surrounded his home. He didn't know if he would ever use the device, but it was complete. It was ready, and it waited. If he chose to use it, he would be safe, and those around him, the unprepared, and the technologically addicted masses of society would be reverted to primitive tribes. Tall fences, electric and hidden, protected him and the two closest to him, as well as his particle beam weapon that was the size of a sofa. This was his favorite toy, and it sat on a heat-seeking automated turret. It was hard to believe he was a pacifist and a vegetarian, with such space-age weaponry as his hobby and love. In the past, he described his baby to me. It can shoot down any plane. Its target is reached as fast as the speed of light and is vaporized on impact. It can track an object up to 10 miles away and registers enemy hostiles automatically. When on defensive and openly operational, it can annihilate anyone attempting to enter my property. He smiled and pushed up his horn-rimmed glasses. I could see why people thought he was eccentric. One, when looking back at his body of work, would probably even consider him a mad scientist, an Osama bin Laden, or an Antichrist. Definitely an anarchist. He looked more like Gandhi. Before we knew it, Betsy Tenzin, Thupten's mom, was home. and she greeted me warmly and began preparing a typical vegetarian Indian meal. Well, hardly typical for South Carolina, but highly typical for this household. We wrapped up the night with more Nintendo 64 and post-rock. I believe it was Spiderland. We laid a bedding on the floor beside Thubton's bed. I had the Zen garden at the head of my makeshift mattress. I always slept like this, with the Zen garden at my head. I would stretch my arms out at night and scoop my hands in the sand and dream of the beach. Thubton didn't talk much as we drifted off to sleep. I tried not to think about Emily. I asked him again about his crush. He didn't answer me. I assumed he didn't hear or was asleep. Either way, I left it alone. I relaxed my head against the soft, down-filled pillow and began to drift into that dream realm on a cloud. I could vaguely hear a whisper as I left this dimension for Slumberland. I have a crush on you, Jacob. It hit my ears, but as I fell into my dream, it slipped right back out. Maybe it was meant for me not to hear. Maybe it was fate. But I sometimes wish I had reacted, stirred out of my light sleep, and talked to my best friend. Really talked to him. But instead I slept. I slept hard. My mother told me that before I was born, she would dream of tidal waves. I am on the beach, salt water, sand, and seagulls, calling on white noise wind. I dreamt of a resort, of children playing and a lifeguard. Grills are smoking, lotion is drying in the sweltering summer sun, and stereos are defiant sirens. They deny the delicate and sensual song of Poseidon. I walk out on a pier. I walk, and the pier turns into a highway spanning oceans, Oceania. I walk on the highway, cars perilously passing me by. Speedy, smelly, aluminum highway turtles bake their shells in mechanical migration. The sky spans 360 degrees, blue meeting blue with a stripe of concrete, a man-inflicted scar. In the distance, a cloud grows, turning the water and sky black, and a third of the day is darkened. I welcome this. A tidal wave comes like a warring titan. The wave swells and grows, feeding on the karmic bounties put on the heads of a rebellious generation. It destroys everything in its path. I am dead, but it was worth it. The flock is cold, and the world is washed clean. As I'm tossed in the water, I inhale water and see a bright white light. You wanted water, didn't you? Slipping, slipping. Aquarius's last gift. Never-ending death, never-ending life. I awoke suddenly. I was already sitting up in bed. I looked over at the alarm clock. 2:49 a.m. I sat there, trying to remember my dream, sitting hunched over in my pallet on the floor. I closed my eyes. I began to slip back into the sheets when I could see behind my closed eyelids that the room was illuminated. I immediately opened my eyes. I thought that Thubton had gotten up and turned on the lights. That was not the case. I saw him sleeping in bed. The light was coming from the circular window in the ceiling. A brilliant white beam of light bounced around the room. I looked up through the hole, amazed, and checked to make sure the clock still said AM. It did. It was supposed to be dark outside. Was this my imagination? It didn't seem like it. I looked around for Panic, and he was in the corner, sitting like a dog sphinx, staring right at me. I swear I could see words in his eyes. I looked back up at the light and it dissipated like a dying fog. Was this some kind of sign from God? I was strangely perplexed by the dream, but it seemed to drip right out of my head. I looked at the clock. 3:03. It didn't seem like that long, 11 minutes. But then again, it did seem like a dream, and time is funny in dreams. But perhaps I controlled time. Perhaps there was a Chronos, or I was him. I was surprisingly able to go back to sleep. I thought of my mother's broken clock and the golden orbs of time that used to spin in perfectly crafted circles.